Hello, thank you for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Bree Hogue and I'm the sales manager at Powell City of Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. Next week, we welcome Paige McKenzie on July 7th, Mario Livio on July 8th, Julia Alvarez on July 9th, and our first virtual story time is scheduled for July 11th with author Stephanie Campisi. Check out our online calendar for dates and times for these exciting events. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and you can sign up for our weekly events email at powells.com. Tonight, we are honored to welcome Eva Holland in conversation with Ferris Jabr. This event will include a Q&A, and if you'd like to ask a question, there's a question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. If someone has typed a question that you would also like to know the answer to, you can upvote that question, and you can submit your questions throughout the event this evening. You can also support Eva Holland and Powell's by purchasing a copy of her book, Nerve, Adventures in the Science of Fear. A link to buy the book was included in your registration email and will also be shared in the chat a few times this evening. Eva Holland is a writer and editor living in the Canadian Yukon. She's a correspondent for Outside Magazine, and her work has appeared in Esquire, Wired, Smithsonian, and Grantland, among other publications. In her new book, Holland writes candidly about two of her biggest fears: her mother dying and her fear of heights. In 2015 and 2016, Holland was forced to face both in a series of incidents, including the death of her mother. In surviving these events, Holland emerged with a desire to write about her experiences and to find a deeper understanding of fear and how it affects us individually. Nerve has been described as part scientific study and part memoir. Rolling Stone recently said, "In a plague year where our worst fears are real but unseen, possible and indefinable, her book could not be timelier." This evening, Holland is joined in conversation by Ferris Jabr. Ferris Jabr is a contributing editor for the New York Times Magazine and Scientific American. He's currently writing a book about the co-evolution of Earth and life to be published by Random House. Jabr lives in Portland, Oregon. Eva and Ferris, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Eva, it's great to be here in conversation with you. I loved your book, especially because in addition to all the great science writing and history of science, as we were learning in the intro, it's so personal. There's a lot of really intimate scenes in there. And I think it's a really brave form of writing. And so I'm curious, with that in mind, how did this all start for you? Can you tell us a bit about the beginning of this project?
Sure. So the real starting point was my mom's sudden death from a stroke in July 2015. That was, for reasons I explain more fully in the book, my worst fear coming true. My mom had lost both her parents when she was quite young, and so I had grown up being very aware of the lifelong impact those losses had on her, and really scared of the same thing happening to me. And so when she did die, I wasn't a child the way she was, but it felt like, my nightmare is coming true. And then after a few months of pretty intense grief, I realized actually I was going to be okay. I was sad, but I was not going to be sort of marked and harmed in the same ways that she had been. And so that was sort of strangely empowering to say, well, I've just faced my worst fear and survived, and I'm going to be fine. And that made me want to examine my other fears. I had two other kind of major issues going on at the time. One was a serious fear of heights. And the other was that I'd had a series of car accidents that had left me with flashbacks and trauma. So I decided to see if I could confront those two situations as well, and if this sense of empowerment could maybe push me through them and out the other side as well, with maybe a new relationship to fear. and so it was sort of a personal project that I decided to turn into a book, and I wanted to understand the science of what was happening to me and other people along the way.
I particularly remember the scenes in your book where you first hear about your mom being in danger of dying. And could you tell us a bit about where you were when you first got that information and how you found out?
Yeah, I was on a backcountry canoe trip in far northern British Columbia. If anybody knows the Lower Stikine River, it outlets in coastal Alaska, and it was about a 10-day paddling trip. And my mom had a stroke on a Friday night, and we had a satellite phone with us, but we didn't have it turned on. So we were checking in a couple times a week. I think our call dates were Tuesdays and Thursdays or something like that. And so a cousin of mine who works in fisheries management was able to locate a fisheries outpost along this river because the salmon were running, and sent a fisheries officer to look for our camp, basically. And he was able to locate our camp, and he left a note. We were on a day trip at the time. He left a note in camp for us saying, Eva Holland called Nathan regarding your mother. Nathan is my cousin. So you find a note like that, and you think about the effort that was involved in getting it to your backcountry campsite, and you sort of know that your mom is like dead or dying. And so that was how I found out and made the satellite phone call and got the update, and then had to be evacuated from the river essentially to try to get to the hospital in time.
And so what about your fear of heights? You know, where do you think that came from? Because with your mom, there's a pretty definite history. There's some reasons there that you sort of write about, but with heights, is that more arbitrary, or is there an explanation for that for you, or?
It's harder to know for sure. There's a lot of sort of theoretical explanations for phobias, and it's not certain sort of, there's no one explanation for everyone, and maybe no one explanation even for any given individual. One of my earliest memories is of falling down an escalator when I was 3 or 4 at the airport in Toronto. And so I've wondered if that is part of it. There's evidence to suggest it can be hereditary. My dad was afraid of heights when he was younger. There's evidence that can suggest that it relates to sort of your perception of movement through space. So there's different studies that are suggestive of different causes. It may be, 3 or 4 things in my case. But it was very, very focused specifically on a sense of exposure to falling, as opposed to some people who are afraid of heights struggle with elevators or airplanes or bridges. I don't have any issue as long as I don't feel like I can trip over my own feet and fall, or if I'm dangling. I also don't like to dangle.
Mm-hmm. And with the car crashes, what's interesting to me about that is that it kind of gets to this line between fear and trauma. How do you think about those two things? Is trauma a form of fear? Are they closely related? Are they the same thing in the end?
Yeah, these distinctions are tricky and kind of fascinating, I think. I ended up thinking about, so I think the definition of trauma is that you experience something terrifying, often threatening to your life or to the life of someone near you. And what I ended up thinking of it as really about memory and about memories of fear. Like it's your past kind of reaching out to grab you and not letting go. And that I think is distinct from other types of fear that are often about the future. If you think about sort of like anxiety type fears, it's often about like consequences and what might happen and anticipation. And then trauma is all driven from your past. Whereas other types of fear might not, like tons of people who are afraid of sharks have never seen one. So I think that was the main distinction for me, was between sort of like, is this about fearing the future, or is this about fear from your past, which can push you to fear the future too. But for me, it was really grounded in these past experiences. I had never been afraid of driving or cars before. And it didn't feel abstract. It felt like my mind was being hijacked by these memories when they would flare up, and they would take over my body.
That's really interesting. That in some ways that makes me think about research on how physical pain and emotional or social pain are basically the same thing from the brain's perspective. The brain interprets it, experiences it in the same way. So, to be socially rejected or ostracized is a physical injury, a physical insult in some respects. And then with trauma and fear, it's literally like you are re-experiencing whatever caused the trauma in the first place. So that fear, that terror that you talked about, you just relive it all over again.
Yeah, I'm sure there have been times when they've hooked people up to, every monitoring device and are able to say you are undergoing a physiological fear experience right now, absent any visible threat.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was one of the things that really jumped out at me from all my research, is how physical an experience fear is. We think of it as an emotion, a feeling, right? But it's so much of it is experienced in our bodies in terms of whether that means your heart racing and your chest constricting, or you're getting goosebumps, or even just that kind of shivery, nervous feeling you can get, or your pupils dilating. There's so much of it is about our body reacting. And then we say oh, I'm scared. But that was sort of a revelation to me, I think, when I started this project, was how physical the whole thing is, in terms of a bodily process that you experience through physical symptoms.
Mm-hmm. So the three central fears in your book, fear of heights and falling, fear of death, of losing someone, and fear of driving in a traffic accident. What connects all of those to you? Is there a way to sort of step back and come up with a more general definition of what fear is?
The best definition I found was from a 19th century psychologist who defined fear as the anticipation of pain. And that touches more on what we talked about in terms of the sort of the future-driven fears, but I think it works for trauma too, because in the case of the car accidents, my past pain was causing me to fear renewed pain or repetition of that pain. So I liked that. I thought that was sort of a neat and tidy definition of fear, the anticipation of pain. It covers so much, whether that's fear of a loved one leaving you or dying, fear of getting hit by a truck, fear of ripping a Band-Aid off, all of that is anticipated pain. So I liked that definition a lot. One was kind of a favorite umbrella, I think.
Yeah, I like that too. I liked its simplicity and its elegance. And then I started, though, to think about, the fear of the unknown, or sort of more vague or unformed fears. And I was kind of thinking of that scene in a horror movie where someone's standing at the edge of a really creepy forest or something like that. And they're not really fearing anything specific. They're not really anticipating a particular type of pain. It's just that there's the sense of something bad is going to happen, something wicked this way comes. And so I was thinking, fear, anticipation of pain or of harm more generally, just something bad is going to happen to me in this situation. And that got me wondering, in your research, did you learn anything about the evolutionary purpose of fear, or the biological purpose? Why do other animals experience fear?
Yeah, it's one of our most important survival tools, and it's something resembling fear, or aversion to threat, aversion to harm, it's found all the way from us to tiny organisms. I saw the example of a sensitive plant curling up when you touch it as an example of an organism exhibiting something that we could understand as fear. If we understand fear as basically threat avoidance. So yeah, it's evolved to teach us to avoid the things that can harm us. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing that I learned is that's one reason why it can be so hard to change our fears, or to cure a phobia, for instance, because our fear memories, our fear memories specifically are intended to be durable. They're intended to last. So if you survive, there's a crocodile in that watering hole, you're supposed to remember forever there's a crocodile in that watering hole, so that you don't have to chance it a second time. It's really sort of deeply embedded in us, which is why it's so hard to change. When it does sort of go into overdrive or react inappropriately, it can feel really, really hard to change.
Yeah, that's really interesting because just about every organism that I can think of has a way to sense and respond to its environment. But then there seems to be different levels of biological fear when memory and consciousness become involved, because there's a different, like, you can imagine a bacterium senses a pH gradient or a temperature, and that's not good for it, and it reacts, it moves away. But then to, like you were saying, to actually have a trace, a physical trace in an organism that tells it again not to do that thing, that makes a sticking point so that it doesn't make that same mistake. That, and that sort of seems to be the basis for the kind of fear that we experience as humans. And then that's really interesting to think about our kind of cultural histories too, and how entwined fear and narrative are, because so many of the oldest stories and folktales are about danger of some kind. And there's a lot of kind of scholarly thought about, stories being warnings, basically, a way of sort of teaching warnings, carrying them through generations.
Yeah. It's I like the way you mentioned a trace, because that's exactly the language that neuroscientists use when they talk about sort of stored memories. And that's such a big piece of, I sat down to write a book about the science of fear, and I ended up sort of like secretly on the side writing about the science of memory, because so much of it is tied together. Fear memories serve this purpose of warning us, but they're also the reason why we have so much trouble with fear often, with being afraid of things or upset about things. The rule holds for sort of upsetting memories as well, that they're durable in a way that happy memories aren't, which is logical from a survival standpoint, but really frustrating as a person. Like, you'd much rather remember the good times more vividly than the bad times. But when you're stewing about some insult or something in the middle of the night, that's partly your sort of survival mechanisms at play.
Mm-hmm. And that's something you write about, is that, fear has this obvious benefit, but then it can become maladaptive, as the scientists like to say. It can turn from beneficial to harmful against the person it's supposed to protect.
Yes, definitely. And that was what I was experiencing on a pretty manageable scale, relatively speaking, was my fear kind of running amok, being driving on a highway is dangerous, so that's not as good of an example. But in the case of my fear of heights, I would be, unable to be 3 feet off the ground. And there was no, I wasn't even gonna bump my elbow if I fell. I was, maybe gonna scrape my knee and get a bruise, but my body would be convinced that I was in mortal danger. And it was just like this system kind of like flaring into overdrive without any rational basis for that response, and is really embarrassing and really frustrating to deal with.
And in addition to your mom's passing, there was a particular ice climbing trip that seemed like it was pretty pivotal. Can you tell us what happened on that trip?
Yeah, that's the event that really pushed me to say, okay, I have to do something about this. It was about 7 months after my mom died, and I had kind of come through the worst of it and was sort of like, oh, I'm gonna be okay. And I went ice climbing with some friends in northern British Columbia, which sounds like a strange thing for someone who's afraid of heights to do, but I had been approaching this as sort of like ad hoc therapy for a little while. And I just pushed myself too hard and too far on this climb. And I got cold and I got hungry and tired. And we were coming down, and I made it through the climbing and the rappelling. And then we had this hike out down a frozen creek. And I just really lost it. I just couldn't make myself walk forward down this creek. I was convinced that I was going to slip and fall all the way down the mountain and die. And I didn't have the language at the time to understand that I was having a panic attack, but that's more or less what it was. And a group went ahead, and then 3 people stayed back with me. I was saying stuff like, I'm just gonna stay here all night. Like, it's, you know, it's below freezing, I'm soaking wet, it's getting dark, it's February in the subarctic, and like I would have been dead by midnight. But I was refusing to move. And so 3 people stayed back, and sort of 2 of them held my hands, and one of them pointed exactly where I should put my foot each time, and they got me down the mountain over a couple of hours. And that was, you know, previous incidents had been embarrassing, you know, like a cry in front of people, or, you know, but this was dangerous. And I said, okay, this is not acceptable. The choice now is to like never go into these places anymore, to never be at elevation, or to do something about this, because I can't be putting myself and others at risk.
Mm-hmm. And in parts of the book, you really push yourself to confront your fears. How did you decide to confront your fear of heights?
The first thing I did was sign up for skydiving. I'm assuming that's what you're referring to. Which it turns out is not a recommended form of exposure therapy for heights phobia. It was not helpful. It did not. I had this idea that like, if I can just push myself hard enough, I can prove to myself that there's nothing to be afraid of. Like I can sort of like burst through to the other side, you know, like the Kool-Aid pitcher coming through the wall. But that's not how this stuff works at all. So the next thing I did was a more traditional form of exposure therapy. I sort of DIY'd it, but following a workbook. And that's the idea there, is that you take very incremental steps. And it's not, what my fundamental misunderstanding was, I thought it was about just like gritting my teeth and hanging on and pushing through, but it's not about gritting your teeth while freaking out. It's about teaching yourself to remain calm. And so it's not about push, 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 push. It's about take one tiny step. And if that's as far as you can go without starting to get stressed, then you take only that one tiny step. And the next time you try to take one more tiny step, and build a new pattern in your brain that says, I'm not afraid, as opposed to sort of hanging on for dear life while being terrified, but trying to force your way through anyway, which doesn't ultimately help you.
And a large part of your book concerns treatments, various treatments for fears and phobias. And there's one in particular, I want to make sure I say it right, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR. Can you tell us what that means and what that involves?
Sure. So EMDR was, I don't know if the right term is invented or discovered or developed in the late 80s in Northern California, of course. And it is a therapy primarily aimed at trauma, but I think it has different clinical uses now. And the idea is that the therapist prompts you to move your eyes back and forth from side to side in a rhythm. Originally, it was literally a therapist going like this, but now they have different tools. You can put in earphones that beep. I held sort of like buzzing, vibrating pods in my hands, and the left-right buzzing just automatically forced my eyes back and forth. And so a trained therapist talks you through whatever the event at issue is while you do this eye movement stuff. And it's like something about the combination of sort of opening up these memories for discussion while making these eye movements lays them to rest. So when we talk about intrusive memories in the context of trauma, and what I was talking about earlier with people sort of with memories like reaching out from your past and hijacking you, it sort of puts them to bed so they can't do that anymore. And you still remember them, but they lose that power to grab you by the throat, in my case, while you're driving down the highway. It sounds really woo-woo, and they don't know how it works. They don't understand the physical mechanisms at play. There was a lot of skepticism about it in the 90s, understandably, but it has been proven to be more effective than the placebo effect, sometimes significantly more effective than the placebo effect in a large number of clinical trials at this point. And so it's now become like a pretty accepted practice, and it's widely used in the therapeutic community. It does sound really strange. I thought it sounded strange. One of my favorite quotes that I found in all my research was a woman who survived the Oklahoma City bombing and received EMDR in the aftermath, said EMDR was the strangest thing she ever experienced, with the exception of the bomb. I thought that was such a, like, I mean, I assume getting blown up is a horrible experience, but also a very strange one. And EMDR was very strange. It's really strange. It feels weird in your body when it's happening, in my experience.
Yeah, it did sound kind of kooky, almost like a Svengali pendulum type thing. You know, it sounded like something from like the 19th century, but it helped you, right? You found that it was beneficial.
It was hugely effective for me. It helped that, from my understanding, that my trauma was quite defined and specifically related to this act of driving on a highway. The more complex your trauma is, the harder it is to treat it. But for me, it solved the problem. I'm still a more cautious driver than I was before I had those accidents, which is probably a good thing. But I don't have visions of my own doom while I'm driving anymore. I don't fixate on the possibility of dying. I don't cry and hyperventilate and have flashbacks. That all went away almost instantly. It's still kind of surreal to me how effective it was. I don't like to sound like too much of a homer for a particular, practice, but I definitely am now one of those people who's like, oh yeah, go to therapy. Therapy's amazing.
And how much do you think the eye movements and the rhythm were a part of why it's effective versus kind of sitting down, talking to somebody, kind of reprocessing what you went through? Because I think you mentioned there was maybe some question as to like which one of those is really more important in the end.
I think the eye movements are pretty integral to it. That's how they test it when they do, like, the control group is usually talk therapy, so the same conversation without the eye movements. And something, I don't know, the thing that I thought of immediately when I heard of it is our REM sleep. And I know that, like, our REM cycles are implicated in our memory formation. So there is something about our eyes moving back and forth that seems to be related to our memory systems. And so that seems plausible to me. There's also just the fact that it did put you in a sort of a deep state of calm, or sort of a hypnotic effect. So I don't know how much that makes a difference relative to just talking to somebody, but it felt like a really, really specific and really physical experience to undergo, that I don't think talk therapy would have had the same type of effect.
That's really interesting to think that it could be almost a form of forced reorganization of one's memory files, so to speak, kind of refreshing, removing things around. That's really interesting. And I thought an especially fascinating part of the book concerned a pill-based treatment for fear. When you travel to Amsterdam and you take some medicine. And can you tell us about, what is that pill? How is that supposed to work? And what did that treatment involve?
Yeah, it comes back to memory science again. So we've known for some time that when we put memories into long-term storage, for lack of a better term, that there's a protein synthesis process that goes on in our brains when that happens. And we know that beta blockers can disrupt protein synthesis. So more recently, what a neuroscientist who's now based in Montreal discovered is that the process known as memory reconsolidation, which is when you sort of like call up your memories from storage and look at them and then put them away again, in the simplest terms, that there's a protein synthesis process for reconsolidation as well as the initial storage process. And so the logical follow from that is that beta blockers can disrupt reconsolidation as well. And so neuroscientists had shown that beta blockers could disrupt fear conditioning in lab rats. they could undo the fear conditioning, essentially, but only if the memory was activated at the time that the pill was delivered, that the drug was delivered. If the memories were passive, then the drug didn't do anything. So what this psychologist in Amsterdam, Meryl Kint, did with that research is she applied it to humans, and she started triggering people's fears to activate those fear memories, and then giving them propranolol, which is a common medication. People take it for blood pressure. Sometimes people take it for stage fright. And in isolation, it's a one-off. It might sort of slow your heart rate and make you feel calm. But in combination with this memory activation, it does something more significant, which is it appears to unravel the connections between your memories of past panics and your future panic reactions. So if you have a phobia of, well, let's use me as the example, heights, part of what's happening when I freak out about heights is that I'm remembering all the other times I've felt scared of heights, all the other times I've panicked. It's this sort of channel that I go down in my brain. And so I went to Amsterdam and to undergo this treatment, and she had really strong results with people who have specific phobias of things like spiders or snakes. And I wasn't sure if heights would work in the same way because it's less precise, you know? And I wasn't sure how she would scare me in Amsterdam, since I mostly get scared on mountains. And Amsterdam is like notoriously the flattest place in the world. But she sent me up, she put me in the bucket of like a ladder truck at a fire station and sent the ladder up as high as it would go, which was very unpleasant and frightening. And then she gave me this pill, and 24 hours later, she sent me back up in the bucket, and I was completely fine. I was taking selfies. I was looking at the view. The day before, I'd been barely able to stand. So something about her process, when it works, seems to like decouple the train between your memories of your past panics, and you don't go down that channel anymore in future. And it sounds very sci-fi and strange, and hard to believe, but it appears to have worked for me, at least in some ways. And it's worked for a lot of other people as well. I know she was working on trying to adapt it for trauma and was having challenges with that because it's less clear cut what triggers you, what those memories are. It's much more precise if you're afraid of something like snakes, to show somebody a snake and then give them a pill. But it was a pretty amazing experience.
Yeah, that is amazing. And when I was reading the sections where you talk about the consolidation and the protein synthesis involved, and the physical mechanisms in the brain, it started, and we have that term plastic. People like to talk about the brain as plastic and neuroplasticity, and I started to think of fear and memories as almost like this physical material, like something malleable, like wax, that could be kind of half remelted and then changed, be reshaped and then re-solidified into sort of a new trace in the brain. And I don't know, just the way you wrote about it made me think of it in a new way, and I thought that was really helpful and interesting.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. It's so hard to come up with analogies for our brain because they all feel inadequate, but yeah, I like that.
Yeah, it's always so abstract. So who is patient SM? You write about patient SM, and what is unique about their relationship to fear?
Patient SM is a really famous neuroscience patient. She's been studied for more than 30 years, and she is pretty well medically fearless. She has a very rare genetic disease called Urbach-Wieta that calcifies portions of your brain. It also does some strange things to your skin and your throat, and has various other consequences. But for our purposes, the important thing is that it calcifies portions of your brain, and it specifically seems to be attracted to the amygdala, which is the structure in our brain that it's often called the fear center. It's more precise to say that it's sort of like the threat assessment center. It looks at the incoming data and says, yes, that's a threat. Yes, we'll fire up the fear response. So it's not that patient SM doesn't have the mechanisms to feel fear. It's that she doesn't have the mechanism to like trigger that reaction, in the usual way, at least. And this is a really, really incredibly dangerous way to live, as it turns out. She would have had the effects of this disease from about age 10 on, so she can remember being afraid when she was younger. But she's totally fearless in the usual ways that we think about these things. She doesn't flinch if she has a gun held to her head. She's not afraid of anyone. She'll never back down from a fight. It's her identity is anonymous, but we know quite a lot about her personal life, and we know that it's been really hard because she has no sense of self-preservation, and she has no sense of consequences. She sometimes forgets to eat. She's really bad with money. She can't really hold down a job. Consequences, right? These are when we think of being fearless, we're like, oh, you'd never be afraid of the dark or of scary movies or something, but she has no fear of anything. No fear of rejection. This was the part that really touched me about her. You hear that somebody is fearless and you might think they're maybe kind of a jerk, but she's apparently just like an incredibly kind, generous person. But she comes on too strong and she scares people away. It's like she lives her life without guardrails. And it makes me really sad. But it also really reframed how I thought about fear. I thought about fear as an obstacle to be overcome. I thought of it as an inconvenience, an embarrassment. And learning about her life made me really value fear, even though sometimes it annoys me and sometimes it overreacts. It's like, it's something that you want to have.
That's really interesting too, to think about the interpersonal benefits of fear, that it's something that also exists between people and people can pick up on. It's not just something for you all the time.
Yeah. It's, well, we're living with a global conversation about fear right now, I guess.
Yeah. Have family and friends been coming to you for advice about dealing with fear and anxiety during the pandemic?
Not so much friends and family. Some of the interviews I've done for media have asked me for advice about managing anxiety and fear, and I try to offer what I can, but the idea of sort of positioning myself as some kind of mental health practitioner in a pandemic makes me nervous. I do think I learned things that have been helpful to me. I've heard from some people that they found the book useful. But I never even thought about this context while I was working on it. I was so focused on individual experiences and internal experiences, not this global threat. So I hope it's useful to people, but I don't feel like I have a lot of value to add, other than that I've really learned that fear is impermanent and it's changeable, and also that it's really natural and not something to be ashamed of.
And having gone through this journey, where do you stand with your personal central fears? Are any of them still unresolved?
None of the 3 fears that I start the book with are still unresolved. I still have new things that scare me regularly. I don't feel like I have acquired any new kind of patterns of fear with something that consistently sort of haunts me at this point. Maybe that will come at some point, but now I guess my fears are more a la carte. And I feel like I have better tools for responding to them. Nothing has changed in the moment of feeling fear, that first spike, but I have better tools now to step back and say, okay, you know what's happening right now. Is this valid? Is this reasonable? And if not, here's what you can do to try to calm this down.
And I think at parts of the book, you talk about being afraid of fear itself and how powerful that can be. Has that changed for you? Do you feel like you have a better handle on fear itself overall, or is that still something that is scary?
I think I'm still working on that part. I haven't, even though I broke these patterns of fear that I had earlier with heights and driving and worrying about my loved ones dying, I still expect them to reassert themselves. Like, it hasn't been that long, you know, it's been only like less than a year and a half since I went to Amsterdam. And I still kind of expect sometimes that, like, I'm sort of surprised now still when I'm driving and I'm okay. So I still have the fear of fear, I think, but it's getting better with time.
Mhm. Okay, so I think we're supposed to leave some time for questions and switch over to that. Does that sound okay to you if we look
Yeah,
at some?
sounds great.
Okay. Let's see, there's one here from Susan Hoffman. Does your book address the relationship between anger and fear? Do some people appear to be acting out in anger, but in reality, fear is driving their behavior?
Oh, that's such a great question. I do not get into anger much in the book, maybe only a little tangentially. And I've thought about doing a follow-up about anger, and you're right, they're totally connected. Um, so often we express our fear through anger. I think that's really common. And I don't get into it in the book, but maybe I'll have to add a chapter in some future edition.
Let's see. Ryan Gallagher asks, how do you think therapy might change as folks have to distance or self-quarantine? And can virtual therapy sessions replace being in the same room with a trained professional or a group of others?
I think that virtual tools can probably achieve some therapies better than others. I think there's something to be said for being in a room with someone. But I think that, you know, sitting in your car to get some privacy from your family and Zooming with a therapist is better than nothing. I wrote about EMDR recently for the New York Times, and I heard from some people afterwards who said, like, what, you know, they were supposed to do EMDR and then the pandemic hit, and it is, because of the physicality of it, it is a trickier one to do by distance. But I think that they are working on ways to get people set up with, like, the headphones or whatever in their own homes, and then have the therapist talk you through it virtually. So that's one where it's like, it's definitely trickier with distancing. Group therapy, that's a really good question. I think for people who find group work helpful, and of course it's like also one of the more affordable options, this is going to be a challenging time. I don't know what, for instance, like AA meetings are doing with this situation. Our local Hospice Yukon is a group that provided free grief counseling to me after my mom died, and they do, I know they already had a grief walking group. So that's something that, like, is relatively COVID friendly, to have a small group walking outdoors. But it's definitely, it's a tricky confluence of need for mental health support with inaccessibility of mental health support right now. And I hope that that organizations are working on logistical solutions and funding.
So there's a two-part question here. I noticed on your website that the working title of the book was Shake It Off, A Personal Journey Through the Science of Facing Our Fears. Could you talk a bit about how your experience of titling your book, and related to that, how did the book evolve from when you first started the process to what was published?
Yeah, good question. Yes, my original title was Shake It Off. And I was really focused then, of course, not having done the work yet, I was really focused then on this idea of curing, facing our fears in order to overcome them or cure them. And a couple things happened along the way. One is that I ended up being interested not just in specifically the science of cures, but also the science of emotion more broadly, and these ties to memory science, these ideas about fearlessness. So it got a bit bigger than what I initially envisioned in terms of the scope of the science I wanted to look at. The other was that I sort of ended up de-emphasizing the overcoming side, even though I do have success with a lot of my efforts in the book. That sort of ultimately became not the point for me. The point was having sort of a healthier relationship with my fear by the end, rather than like defeating it in single combat, you know? And the third thing is just that I believe there was a focus group that found that the Taylor Swift reference was not widely appreciated. So, Shake It Off at that point didn't feel as relevant either, because it was so focused on this idea of shaking off your fears. And I think one of my editors said, I feel like this book is about something bigger than that. So we started looking for something different, and I was really happy with the title we came up with in the end.
Yeah, it's a great title. Okay, those look like all the official questions that have been typed so far. Something else I was wondering, because you mix so much science with intimate history and some really emotionally intense memories and scenes, I was just wondering, as a writer, what it's like to sit down and actually write something like that. Is it painful? Is it cathartic? Is it everything?
Parts of it were painful. Yeah. Parts of it were hard to write. I did not write the book in order. I wrote most of the personal parts first while I was doing the scientific research. So even in chapters that are sort of like personal science, I often wrote the personal sections weeks or even months before the science sections, and then sort of wove them together after the fact. That was just how I managed my time. And so I think that helped in terms of having the framework and then sort of slotting pieces in. But yeah, parts of it were hard to write. The hardest part was the section on my mom's death. And it was the first part I wrote. Parts of it, I had been working on a personal essay about my mom's death since 2015. And so I pulled up those notes in 2018 when I started working on the book in earnest full time, and adapted them into what's now chapter 1 and chapter 3 of the book. Mm-hmm. And so that's the part of the book that got the most attention for sure. I wrote it months before some of the rest, and I went over it and over it and over it until it didn't hurt to read it anymore, But it's definitely the most sensitive part, and the part I was most concerned about expressing myself clearly. It was the part I was worried other members of my family might not like necessarily. So that part was scary. Other parts less so. Others were kind of fun to write. Even the car accident scenes were sort of fun to write. The part that made me nervous was the weaving together. I knew that I could write the two halves. I just didn't know if I could make them feel like a whole.
Mm-hmm. And actually, somebody's asked a very related question to that. They say, you've mentioned moving from reporting to narrative nonfiction. How is it to transition between those two writing styles?
Yeah, it was a challenge. I think in some ways it was the central challenge of this book project, was to sort of hammer those two halves together. And I tried to write the more sciencey parts in a narrative style so that they wouldn't feel like too jarring of a departure from the memoir. And what I ended up doing ultimately, I think, was putting more of myself in the science parts than I intended to kind of bridge the gaps, so it wasn't like memoir and then like hard right turn and like now we're talking about science. So I ended up putting in little anecdotes about my memories or something my mom had told me once, or something sometimes in kind of the hard science portions. And I thought of it consciously as I was working on it as sort of like sewing, and I thought a lot about sewing and stitching, and the more I could sort of cross-pollinate the references in the two halves, the more it would feel like a whole. And so I thought, if I can sort of lead into this section on neuroscience with a memory of my mom, and then use that as a jumping off point to talk about memory science, let's say, then hopefully that will feel less jarring than the like, it can sometimes be like, as I drove my car down the highway, I thought about trauma. Like it can be kind of feel a little forced sometimes, and I hoped that it wouldn't feel forced.
No, it reads very seamlessly, so it's very well woven together. How much reporting did you have to do on yourself and your family? When you were writing the autobiographical parts, did you have to go back and verify, anything from like, what was the weather like that day, to does my memory actually match my friends and family members' memories?
Yeah, I did some of that, not a ton. What I sort of did instead, because, you know, one of the points of the book is that memory is fallible. You know, that's something that's sort of built in. Is I often wrote it rather than as a statement of fact. I would say, I remember in my memory. And so that's sort of like a little asterisk of like, this is how I remember it. Because if I'm writing about something that frightened me, ultimately the point isn't what really happened. The point is how I remember it in terms of how it affects me later in this fear pattern that we're talking about. And so I didn't want to tug too hard on the thread of like, what if your memories aren't accurate? Because, you know, my memories of these fearful moments with something like a heights panic aren't accurate. I'm going to die, and I'm not going to die like at all. So it's a tricky thing, but I did do some fact checking with my family. And the whole science portion was actually formally fact checked, but in terms of the personal side, I checked some stuff with my dad about his childhood fear of heights, and also some stuff that he knew about my mom. I checked with my mom's sisters about some things about their parents' deaths, and also about my mom's childhood. And those were sometimes like hard things to reach out and ask about, like, hey, can we talk about how your dad died? I never met him, but, you know. So those were sometimes hard things to check up on. But I didn't, so much of the personal stuff either happened when I was alone or just me and my mom. And so there wasn't anybody really to check it with. And that's partly also why I sort of have the caveats of like, this is how I remember this.
And did your role as a journalist and writer ever conflict with your role as a patient?
Yeah, not like ethically, I guess, but logistically. In Amsterdam, they specifically told me not to take any notes for 24 hours after the procedure. And I was like, what? They're like, we just need you to not even think about it for 24 hours. And I was like, but I have to write this section of the book. Like, so for people who don't know, I went to Amsterdam 2 weeks before my book deadline. And I had this last chapter to fill in. And so after I went up in the fire truck, they were like, yeah, don't think about it. Don't write about it. Don't dwell on it. Don't tell anyone about, like, just put it out of your mind to the fullest extent possible for 24 hours. And that was alarming for me. But it worked out okay. It turned out it was such a vivid memory that it was fine. And then also with the EMDR, I found those sessions really draining, really physically draining. I would come home, I always did them on Friday afternoons, and I would come home and I would just be exhausted, and I would have to make myself sit and type up all my notes about how that session went, because I wasn't taking notes while I was in session. I didn't want my note taking to compromise my therapy. I needed to be like in the moment, you know? And so that was challenging as well, forcing myself through those kind of marathon days. But other than that, I think it was pretty straightforward in terms of the sort of personal / reporting.
Alyssa Chervenka asks, some of your fears seem more hypothetical. You won't necessarily fall from a great height or get into another car crash. However, the death of a loved one is inevitable. Is there anything you learned in your research about how to prepare for or get through the inevitable?
That's a great question. I think part of what's hard about these things when you haven't faced the inevitable yet in your life is understanding that it is inevitable. You know, if you've never lost someone you're really close to, you can feel kind of bulletproof until it happens, right? It's hard. So I guess people vary. Some people really dwell on the possibility, and some people, it never really crosses their mind until it's sort of upon them. Sorry, my dog is getting restless. I'll take him out after this is done. In terms of preparing for the inevitable, I guess it's knowing that intense grief is temporary. Grief overall is not temporary, right? Grief is a lifelong. I think we're bad as a culture at talking about grief and preparing people for grief. There's this idea that it's sadness, right? You're sad, and maybe you're sad for 2 weeks, and then you go back to work and you go back to your life. But that's not, you know, it can be a very physical experience. I had headaches for months. I spoke to people whose hair fell out when they were grieving. Some people can't sleep. Some people can't stop sleeping. It's not just sadness, it's anger. It's sometimes there's things that you find really funny about the whole thing, but nobody else knows how to laugh with you because we're weird about death. So I think the way to prepare for the inevitable is to have a better sense of what's coming, and that it is inevitable, and that the worst of it is temporary, which is sort of impossible to hang on to when you're in it. But now that I've been sort of through it once, I hope that in future I'll be able to remember, like, you're not going to be this sad and angry and headachy forever.
Okay, great. Maybe as a final question, are you allowed to say anything about potential next books, or is that under wraps for now?
I have some ideas I'm working on. I hope to be able to do another book sooner than later, you know, pandemic permitting. And I can say that I'm not done talking about neuroscience, I don't think.
No.
I hope not.
Well, excellent. This is a good place to stop the conversation tonight. I want to thank everyone for joining us for tonight's event. And somebody in the chat mentioned making sure to say to Eva, Happy Canada Day, which is today. So happy Canada Day from Powell's and everyone watching. We want to thank you for joining us for our event, and it was a pleasure to host Eva Holland in conversation with Ferris Jabr, and to welcome all of you to our second virtual event of our virtual event season. You can purchase a copy of Nerve by visiting us at powells.com. I also shared it in the chat function tonight, a link to that book. And while there at powells.com, please be sure to check our lineup of other upcoming virtual events. We look forward to seeing you at another one of our events soon. Have a good night. Thank you, Eva, and thank you, Ferris.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, everyone, for coming.